Hello, and welcome to Scattered Terrain. My name is Meredith, and today I'm going to be showing you how I make my bedrolls.
Here's what you're going to need. Some toilet paper, though you could also use paper towel and it would work just fine. PVA glue mixed half and half with water. A pair of scissors. Your painting supplies and whatever paints you're using. Optionally, I like to have a nice clear matte spray varnish to seal the bedrolls when I'm done. We're going to start off by removing 2 sheets of toilet paper from the roll, then folding that neatly in half along the perforation and just smoothing that down to make sure it's folded nice and clean. Then I'm going to flip this over and take hold of the edge that has that raw perforation, and I'm going to fold this in half until that perforated edge is just shy of meeting up to the fold. That way it's hidden by that clean edge. Then I'm going to take the whole thing and spin it lengthwise and fold it into thirds so that I have a shape that is just bigger than a 1 by 2 inch footprint. This is going to form the base of our bedroll. The next step is to give this a good soaking in PVA glue, so I'm going to grab that plastic tray that the PVA doesn't stick to once it's dry, and then I'm going to get my bottle of half water, half PVA glue, and I'm going to start off by folding open the bedroll and putting a little bit of this glue mixture on the inside before closing it up and thoroughly soaking it from above. That way I don't accidentally wind up with dry patches later that are still soft underneath. I'm going to just work the white glue in with my finger a little, and then we're going to flip it over and saturate the other side. And as I go, I just want to make sure that I'm smoothing those edges together. Then we'll flip this back over to make sure that the seam is down so that we won't see it on the final bedroll. And I'm just going to use my fingers to smooth things out a little, make sure that none of our corners are too pointy. They will be rather sharp if they dry with a bit of a point to them. And just smooth the edges with my fingers so that we don't have any rough spots. Now I'm just going to slide this up out of the way while we prepare the blanket and pillow. This is going to take 1 more square of toilet paper. Now with this particular toilet paper, it has a texture on one side and the other side is more smooth. So I'm going to make sure I have the smooth side out as I fold this in half, just like we did before. Following those same steps, making sure we have that nice sharp crease, and then folding it onto itself in thirds, making sure to keep the edges as lined up and square as possible, and making sure to keep that final perforated fold hidden by the smooth edge. Then using a pair of scissors, you're going to cut off about 1/4 of this folded up piece and set that aside to be used as the pillow later. The remaining 3/4 of our folded up toilet paper is going to be our blanket. So let's slide that tray back down here and do a quick dry test fit. Make sure that the blanket and the bedroll are the same width. And then I'm going to grab that PVA and water and give this guy 1 more quick soaking. Make sure he's completely saturated and that the blanket we're about to put down is going to stick. And I'm just going to do a quick test fit here to get an idea of what my plan is for this blanket. Yeah, I like the look of that. So then we're going to grab the bottle of PVA and white glue, and just as we did with the bottom half, we're going to thoroughly soak the blanket with the glue and water mixture, working it in with our fingers and getting both sides completely saturated. Then I'm going to line the bottom of the blanket up with the bottom of the bedroll and press on it all the way across with my finger to seal the two together. Then as I lay the rest of the blanket down onto the bedroll, I'm just going to scrunch it up between my fingers to give it that rumpled, slept-in look. And do 1 more quick pass with my fingers, smoothing around the edges just to make sure I don't have any rough spots. Then I'm going to go rinse my fingers off quickly because working with dry tissue and wet fingers is difficult. And then we're going to grab that 1/4 inch strip that we cut off, roll it up on itself, and make a nice little pillow. Now, depending on how tightly or loosely you roll this, it's going to make the pillow bigger or smaller. Make the pillow whatever size you feel looks right. And once again, working from inside one of the folds, I'm going to give a good soaking of that PVA white glue mixture to the pillow, making sure to hit it from every available side. And I'm squeezing my fingers a bit here to really work that glue through the center of the tissue. I'm trying not to add too much liquid to this while it's still in my fingers to keep it from falling apart in my hands. But as you can see, anywhere that your fingers are dry and the tissue is wet, it's going to start to stick to you. Then we're going to put a little bit of that PVA mixture down where the pillow's going to go, and set the pillow in place on top of it. And once the pillow is in place, I'm going to give it another good soaking with the PVA and work that in with my finger to make sure that it really saturates in and that I'm getting that nice wrinkled, moved around fabric look as a finish for the toilet paper. And I'm just going to use the back of my pinky nail to make an impression into the pillow like a head was sleeping there. Now, if using your fingernail isn't giving you the sort of indent on the pillow that you want, the back of a large paintbrush also works very well to give you that round head-shaped indent. And then I'm just going to soften the edges a bit with my fingers. All right, and I am liking the way that looks. So now I'm just going to set this aside to dry. You may have noticed when I was folding it on my grid that it did overlap that 1 inch by 2 inch footprint by quite a bit. So now I'm going to show you how I fold the toilet paper when I want to try and make it fit closer to being within its grid space. Just as before, we're going to start off with 2 sheets of toilet paper and fold along the center perforation. Then we're going to line up that rough perforated edge with the top line of my grid and smooth everything out as best we can. Then take that rough perforated edge and fold it down 1/4 inch. That way we have a nice clean edge and a slightly smaller piece of tissue paper. Then you're going to fold the original fold line up to match this new fold line until you have that nice long rectangle. And I try to be careful to keep my edges as lined up as I can before laying it down on the table and pressing that seam flat. And this corner is not quite square, so I'm just gonna take a moment and tuck that back in. There we go. And then being very careful to keep that nice clean edge, I'm gonna turn this lengthwise and line up with one of my grid lines again. And this time I'm gonna fold the top of my tissue down 1/2 inch. Then we're going to continue folding the remaining length in thirds. And if you have any corners that stick out at this point, just fold them to the inside and they'll be hidden. Now, as you see here, our little wrapped up package fits much better into that 1 inch by 2 inch footprint, but it does still overlap slightly, so I'm gonna wrap this just a little tighter. Then once again, I'm gonna grab that plastic tray to work on and my bottle of PVA glue and water. And exactly as before, we're going to give this bedroll a thorough soaking with our mixture so that it will dry hard. Now, I find it is incredibly useful to have a damp paper towel at the top of my tray so that I can keep my fingers clean and damp. That way I'm not sticky with glue, but I'm also not using dry fingers that stick to the wet tissue. And once I've soaked the back side, we're gonna lay it onto the tray and give it a soaking from the front as well. And once again, just work it over with our finger to get that nice wrinkled fabric look and make sure our edges are smooth. And I'm just gonna work a little more PVA in here because it feels a bit dry to me. And I'm gonna just pat out any large air bubbles that I've got. And then give my fingers a quick rinse on that damp paper towel before we move on to making our blanket. Just like before, that means we're going to grab a single sheet of tissue paper. And this time I'm going to start by folding down the 1/2 inch and then into thirds. And then I'm going to finish by folding in half. Now I'm going to do that quick dry fit to make sure my width is the same for my blanket and my bedroll. Then cut that top 1/4 inch off, set it aside to be the pillow, and give a good soaking of the PVA water mixture to my blanket around all the edges, front and back, and then work it over with my fingers to give it that nice wrinkled fabric look. Then I'm going to line up the bottom of the blanket with the bottom of the bedroll and lay my blanket down while folding it back with my fingers to look like someone has just crawled out of bed. Let's give it a little bit of a wrinkle down here to make it a little bit more interesting. All right, and then we'll go ahead and cover over this with a bit more of the PVA and water. Dampen down a finger here and work that PVA through. Make sure we don't have any dry spots or rough spots. And smooth off the edges with my finger, making sure that none of those corners are sharp. And again, just as before, we're going to grab that top 1/4 inch that we cut off, and we're going to roll that up to make our pillow. Do a quick test fit, make sure it's the size and shape that we want. Then soak it with our PVA mixture and lay it in place on the bedroll. And just as I did the blanket wrinkled up, I'm also going to set this pillow down at a little bit of an angle, just to give it that little bit of a messy, lived-in look. And when I'm happy with where it is, I'm going to give it that final soaking with the PVA white glue. Then just clean up my fingers a little bit here with that damp paper towel. And as a final option, I'm going to show you how I fold the tissue if I'm looking to make bedrolls for my smaller characters. This time, instead of starting with 2 pieces of toilet paper, we're only going to start with 1. And instead of folding it in half, we're going to start by folding it in thirds. Making sure again with that final fold up to keep the raw edge a little bit shy of the clean edge that you're folding to. That way you're hiding the seam. Then I'm going to turn it lengthwise and I'm going to fold down the top 1/2 inch. Then using my fingers to keep everything laying flat on the inside, I'm going to roll that top edge down until my new folded line meets up to the bottom and give it a good firm creasing. And then the final step is going to be to fold it in half in that same direction 1 more time, making it into quarters. And as you can see here, that's still going to fit within the 1 by 2 inch square, but it's going to be quite a bit shorter than the other traditional style bedrolls. Then this stage is no different from the other. We're just going to completely saturate the bedroll base with that PVA white glue mixture, using our fingers to work in the glue and give that nice wrinkled effect to our tissue paper. And we're going to make the blanket and pillow the same way that we did before, taking a sheet of the toilet paper and folding it exactly as we folded the bottom of the bedroll, starting by folding our sheet into thirds, then turning it on its side, folding down that top 1/2 inch, and then folding it into quarters. Now I realized after making this that actually gives us a blanket that is double the thickness of the other bedrolls, so I highly recommend at this point that you actually don't make the final fold, and instead of making that final fold, cut the tissue paper along the fold line. Then we're gonna cut off that top 1/4 of the folded blanket, set it aside to be our pillow, and saturate the remaining 3/4. Now because I have this blanket much thicker than the others, I'm just going to fold 1 corner back as opposed to doing a more wrinkled or rumpled look. Then give it that same soaking in PVA, smooth out the edges. I'm just going to double check that these corners aren't too sharp on this guy. Then get my fingers cleaned off. And I am going to go ahead and, as I recommended with the blanket, I'm going to cut the pillow in half on that fold line. Then roll up the pillow and press it into place. Once you're happy with how they look and everything is thoroughly saturated with the PVA glue, just set these aside to dry. Now in a day or 2, these should be nice and hard and ready to be painted. And here is our original simply folded bedroll now that it's nice and dry. As you can see here, it does fit just slightly outside that footprint. So here is our version that was folded up just a little more to be slightly smaller. And as you can see in the side by side, it just fits on the grid a little bit better. Here's our smaller companion bedroll, and a quick comparison of what that would look like if you cut the blanket in half the way that I recommend. It just makes it look more in keeping with the other bedrolls to have the same difference in thickness. So there you have 3 different ways to fold up the bedroll, but from this point going forward, they're all painted exactly the same. So we're just going to use this middle bedroll going forward. Our next step is to do our painting base coat, so I'm going to grab my very fancy palette and one of my paint brushes. Now I do want this to be a damp brush so that it picks up the paint a little easier and allows the paint to flow just a little smoother. For painting the color of the inside of the bedroll and pillow, I'm going to be using light mocha. So we'll just shake up the bottle and get a little bit of paint on our palette here. And then using the damp brush, I'm going to paint everywhere that I can see the inside of the bedroll. And I want to make sure to really tuck it up against the edge of any blankets that are folded back. And make sure to wrap down around the edge to meet up at the bottom of the bedroll. Just give it a good thorough coating in whatever color you're using, making sure to get your paintbrush up and under any folded back portions of the blanket there, and working all the way down and over the edge. I'll do a quick double check. And you know, it doesn't look like I've got enough paint here, so we'll just add a little more. Give that a nice once over. I'm just gonna add a little bit of extra paint along the sides of the pillows in these folds here, because I don't want to have any holes that show up as black along the edges. And we'll just put a little more paint in here. Alright, and it looks like I've got full coverage on that, so we're just going to set him aside for a few minutes to dry before moving on to our base coat for the blanket. Then once again, we're going to grab our fancy palette, and this time I'm just using a straight plain brown for the outside of my bedroll. So give the bottle a good shake, and then put some paint onto our palette. Grab that damp brush once again, and this time with our base coat, we want to be a little more careful than we were with the sheets, because this is a darker color and it's going to be lining up at the edges. So I'm going to work the paint into my paintbrush, and then using this nice flat-edged brush, I'm going to come along the bottom edge of my side here and make the line where the bottom of the bedroll rolls up and is connected to that inside sheet material, sort of like where the zipper would be on a modern-day sleeping bag. And then I'm going to spin it around and do the exact same thing on the other side, using the edge of my brush to draw that nice straight line along the edge. And then I'm going to make a line that connects those two together. I find it best to work both edges to the middle. That way, if they don't quite come to the same halfway point, I can fix it on this edge and we don't have a spot that they don't line up. Then moving to the next bit of careful edge work, I'm going to use that same technique to paint the edges of the blanket anywhere that they touch or overlap with the sheet area. Now this process is a little bit tricky and takes a bit of time, but I find that the result that I get is worth it. And then once you've done all of the touchy finicky areas, you can go back in and be a little bit quicker with broader strokes to just fill in the rest of the blanket. And then I'm going to go back in and touch up on the sides anywhere that may be showing through. With these craft paints, you often have to do multiple layers in order to get a full coverage. Alright, and once you've got your entire base coat covered on the top, we're going to set this aside and let that acrylic paint cure a little. And then when it's dry to the touch, we're going to come back and do another layer and make sure that we get to that full opacity. We don't want to have a streaky look. And once again, just set him aside to dry. Once that base coat is completely dry, what I like to do is flip my piece over and cover the entire bottom with the base coat color as well. Just in case it ever gets flipped over at the table, I don't want to have that bright white bottom showing. Then once the bottom of the piece is dry, we're going to go back to our original sheet color, and we're going to come around to the edges and clean up anywhere that the paint may have gotten a little bit messy. So if there's anywhere that the brown overlapped onto the white or a drop of paint fell in just the wrong spot, you can just come back now and paint right over the top of it and get that nice clean edge. And once again, set that aside to dry. Now, I do recommend waiting several hours before moving on to this next step, because just because the paint is dry to the touch doesn't mean that it's cured yet. And if you get acrylic paint wet again with your wash before the paint has cured, it's very easy to wash some of the paint off while you're applying your wash. So now that my bedroll has had time to cure, I'm gonna get some homemade brown wash that I mixed up with a ratio of 1 part paint to 10 parts water, and it's mostly brown paint with just a little bit of black paint mixed in for shadows. And using that same wide brush, I'm gonna soak it in the wash, dab off the extra so that I don't completely drown what I'm working on, and then just give a nice coating with the wash all over the bedroll. And I make sure to give a quick swipe over the back so that we don't have any built-up lines or edges from where we overlap from the front with our brush. Alright, and then give him a quick once over. Make sure there's no pools of wash anywhere we don't want it. I'm just gonna touch up the sheets a little here because it's just a bit too dirty looking. But I have too much wash in my brush. I'm just gonna wring some of that out into the cup here. And then use the edge of my brush to touch those puddles and soak up the extra wash. Then once again, set him aside to dry. Once the wash has dried, the bedroll is going to have a very dingy and dirty look overall. So as our final step, we're going to do some highlights to bring our original colors back. So grabbing my fancy palette and a paper towel, we're going to grab that original light mocha sheet color, give it a good shake, put some onto the palette here, and this time we're going to be doing a dry brushing or an over brushing, so you don't want a wet brush this time. Then you're going to work some of your sheet color into the bristles, and then work most of the paint back out onto your paper towel. And I like to give a quick test in the palm of my hand just to make sure I have the amount of paint that I think I do. And then very carefully, I'm going to just drag the brush along the rough surface of my bedroll sheets so that the paint that's left in the bristles catches and hangs on any of the raised texture. This mimics the effect of light hitting the top edges of things, leaving the deeper areas in a darker shadow. And anytime you feel that you're not getting enough paint transfer, just work a little more paint into your brush and wipe it back off into the paper towel and give the sheets a good once over until you are happy with the amount of light that you've brought back up. And it looks like I need to define the edges of the pillow just a little bit more here. So then, because this is a dry brushing, I don't want to wash my brush and get it wet, so I'm just going to rub as much of the paint out into the paper towel as I can. And then I'm going to grab my original blanket color, and we're going to do the same thing, working paint into the bristles, and then out onto the paper towel before dragging the brush along the texture of the blanket and leaving paint behind on all of the highest raised surfaces. Now, as you can see, because we're switching colors, at first we have a mixture of the two colors in the brush, so I want to add more paint on top until my dry brushing comes out closer to my original brown. Having it be a little bit lighter is not a problem, but you don't want it to be too much lighter. As you can see here, it's still too much of that sheet color, so I'm going to go even more back into that dark brown. There we go, and then I'm just going to drag this over the texture to mimic light reflecting off the highest parts of the surface. Oh, and it needs a little bit more from this side. Give that a quick look, see what we think. And then I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing to the back, giving just a quick rub over those roughest bits of texture so that if for any reason this gets flipped over on the table, it doesn't break our immersion. All right, and now that I'm happy with the way that looks, we'll set him aside to dry, and then as a final step, I'll take him out back and give him a quick spray with that clear matte varnish. And so here our bedroll is, all nice and painted up, alongside our original other two. Now, when I first made my bedrolls several years ago, I wasn't making my own homemade wash yet, so I made my bedrolls using the Citadel Sepia wash. As you can see here, that resulted in a much darker finish. Now, if you like having those much darker punched up shadows, you just make your homemade wash darker than the 10:1 ratio. If you play with it on a paper towel, you can adjust the ratio until you have a wash that's as dark as you like. And so there you have it. That is how I make my basic bedroll. With a few bedrolls on hand of each size, you are ready for any sleeping situation that may come up at your game table. I highly encourage you to have some fun with the blankets when you're folding them back, and have a combination of ways and styles that the sleepers may have flung their blankets off before crawling out of their bedroll. I'd also like to take a moment to give a heartfelt thank you to my patrons. I really appreciate the support that you guys give me, especially over the last few months as they've been a bit light on the content. And I've got a lot of exciting things on the way, so stay tuned. For now, let's take a look at how these might be used on the table. After a long day's journey, you make camp deep in the old forest. Not long into the second watch, a large rustling disturbs your sleep. Emerging from the shadows on all sides are skeletal forms and shifting vines. Out of the darkness, you hear the command, "Take them." Roll for initiative.
And so there you have it. That is how I make my bedrolls. Tune in for the next episode. I'm going to be showing you how I make my vine minis. Stick around.
Thanks for spending some of your time here with me at Scattered Terrain. If you liked that video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you next time.